January 1944. Somewhere in the American Southwest, the desert air is cold before dawn. Barbed wire casts long shadows across packed dirt, inside a fenced compound. Men in worn gray and field green uniforms wait in silence. They are Axis prisoners. Of war Germans, Italians captured thousands of miles from home. They expect interrogation. They expect punishment. Some expect revenge. Instead, a canvas medical tent opens. White fabric. The smell of antiseptic. Soft footsteps on wooden planks. Inside, American nurses move calmly between stretchers. No shouting. No questions about rank, unit, or allegiance. Only bandages, only morphine, only steady hands cleaning wounds made by a war they no longer control. For many of these prisoners, this is the most terrifying moment of all. Not because of cruelty, but because of mercy they were never told to expect. And as the nurses work in silence, the prisoners begin to realize something unsettling. The enemy they feared does not look like the enemy they were promised. That realization did not begin here by accident. It was shaped by events unfolding across the entire war. By the time American nurses began treating Axis prisoners without hesitation, the Second World War had already consumed nearly half the globe. In Europe, Nazi Germany had overrun Poland in 1939. France fell in the summer of 1940. By 1941, German forces pushed deep into the Soviet Union. Italy fought alongside Germany, while Japan expanded across the Pacific. The United States entered the war in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Within months, American troops were fighting on two continents, North Africa and the Pacific, soon followed by Italy, France, and Germany itself. As battles intensified, prisoners of war became unavoidable. Entire units surrendered at once, especially after the Allied victories in North Africa in 1943. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were captured and shipped across the Atlantic. They arrived not in Europe but in America. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States held more than 400 Axis prisoners of war in camps spread across the country from Texas to Arizona, from the Midwest to the Deep South. These camps followed the 1929 Geneva Convention, which required humane treatment, adequate food, shelter, and medical care. But Axis soldiers did not trust those promises. Nazi propaganda had warned them relentlessly. American forces were portrayed as brutal, racially degenerate, and vengeful. Capture, they were told, meant torture or worse. So when wounded prisoners were escorted into American medical facilities, fear followed them inside. What they encountered would challenge everything they believed, but the people delivering that shock were often young women far from the front lines, and they belonged to a cause few of these men had ever imagined facing them in war. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps was not designed for spectacle. It was built for endurance. By World War II, more than 59,000 American nurses served in uniform. They worked in field hospitals, evacuation units, transport ships, and POW medical wards. Many were in their early 20s. Most had never left the United States before the war. Their orders were explicit: treat the wounded, follow medical protocol, Ignore nationality. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were entitled to the same medical care as the captor's own soldiers. For the U.S. military, compliance was not optional, it was policy. But policy alone does not explain what happened inside those tents and wards. Axis prisoners arrived with shattered limbs, infected shrapnel wounds, burns, frostbite, malaria. Some had been wounded for days before capture. Others had received only crude battlefield treatment. They expected interrogation before relief. Instead, nurses cut away uniforms bearing enemy insignia. They cleaned blood and dirt from bodies that had once tried to kill American soldiers. No accusations, no lectures, no revenge. Language barriers were common. Many nurses spoke no German or Italian, but care did not require conversation. Pain looked the same in every uniform, for prisoners raised under authoritarian systems. This was disorienting. The absence of hatred felt unnatural. Some mistook kindness for manipulation. Others broke down in disbelief. Yet the nurses did not adjust their behavior. They did not soften or harden it. They simply continued. And in that repetition, bandage after bandage, patient after patient, the psychological ground of captivity quietly shifted. Because this was not just medical care. It was a confrontation between expectation and reality, one that revealed itself from multiple angles at once. For Axis prisoners, fear did not end with capture. It transformed. Many had been taught that surrender meant disgrace or death. German soldiers carried indoctrination that painted the Allies as cruel jailers. Italian troops, already exhausted by a faltering war, expected humiliation when wounded. Prisoners were placed on American stretchers. Anxiety intensified. Needles, scalpels, strangers in unfamiliar uniforms. Some refused treatment at first. Others watched every movement, waiting for punishment that never came. As nurses worked silently, tension slowly gave way to confusion. Why was no one shouting? Why were wounds treated before questions were asked? For some prisoners, this shattered ideological certainty. If the enemy was humane, then the war's moral narrative began to collapse. That realization, quiet, internal, irreversible, marked the beginning of a different captivity than the one they feared. For American nurses, the uniform erased distinctions. Training emphasized neutrality. Wounds were wounds. Bleeding demanded response, not judgment. Many nurses had lost brothers, fiancés, or friends to the war. Some treated men who wore the same insignia as those responsible. Yet professionalism prevailed. Diaries and letters reveal restraint rather than anger. Nurses described POW patients as frightened, young, and human, never as monsters. They followed orders, but more importantly, they followed medical ethics. And in doing so, they unknowingly became frontline representatives of a different kind of power. One that did not rely on fear. The encounter between fear and professionalism did not end there. It unfolded further through strategy and psychology, shaping the war beyond the hospital walls. Humanity was not a weakness, it was deliberate. The U.S. military understood that POW treatment influenced morale, discipline, and intelligence. Well treated prisoners were less likely to resist camp order. They followed regulations. They cooperated with labor programs permitted under the Geneva Convention. Medical care played a crucial role when prisoners realized their lives were not disposable. Desperation faded. Violence inside camps decreased. Escape attempts became rare compared to European-held POW facilities. Kindness stabilized captivity, not as propaganda but as practical control rooted in law. For many Axis prisoners, American nurses represented something deeply unsettling: authority without cruelty, discipline without humiliation, power without visible hatred. This contradicted years of ideological conditioning. Some prisoners later admitted the experience changed their perception of democracy. Others described shame realizing they had believed lies about their enemy. The shock was not loud or dramatic. It was internal, and it lingered long after bandages were removed. The difference became unavoidable. Reports from the Eastern Front told of starvation and abuse. Allied POWs in Axis camps faced brutality, neglect, and execution. American nurses knew this. They did not mention it. They treated anyway, and in that contrast, the moral distance between systems of war became visible not through speeches, but through care. That distance would soon narrow into a decisive moment when treatment turned into transformation. The turning point did not arrive with gunfire. It arrived in silence. By late 1944, POW hospitals across the United States had settled into routine. Wounded prisoners were processed, treated, and transferred with efficiency. The fear that once filled those wards began to thin. But something else replaced it. Trust. German and Italian prisoners started reporting injuries voluntarily. They no longer hid infections. They no longer delayed care out of suspicion. Some even requested specific nurses by name, recognizing voices, faces, steadiness. This was not fraternization. It was recognition. In one documented case from a Texas POW camp, German prisoners stood at attention not for guards, but when nurses entered the ward, not out of fear, but respect for men raised under rigid hierarchy. This reversal was profound. Authority no longer came from intimidation. It came from competence and restraint. The war outside the wire still raged, but inside, something irreversible had shifted. The enemy was no longer abstract, and once that idea took hold, it began to spread quietly, relentlessly beyond the hospital tents. As the war neared its end in 1945, the effects of that shift became visible beyond the wards. American intelligence officers noticed changes in prisoner behavior. POWs complied with camp regulations at unusually high rates. Discipline problems declined. Violence between prisoners decreased. This was not coincidence. When men believed they would be treated as humans even as enemies, their sense of fatalism dissolved. Survival replaced defiance. Observation replaced hatred. Some prisoners began speaking openly about the war, not under coercion, but because the fear that sealed them into silence had faded. Medical treatment did not extract intelligence. It created conditions where truth was no longer dangerous. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, thousands of former Axis soldiers carried a memory that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had been wounded, they had been helpless, and in that moment, they had been treated with dignity by the enemy. That experience would follow them home into defeated nations trying to understand. how everything had gone so wrong, and it would shape what came next. When the war ended, the barbed wire came down slowly. Axis prisoners were not released overnight. Repatriation took months, sometimes years. But the tone of captivity had already changed. Reports from U.S. POW camps showed low mortality rates, minimal unrest, and widespread compliance. Medical care had played a decisive role. Infection rates dropped. Long-term injuries were reduced. Mental breakdowns became less frequent than expected under prolonged detention. Many prisoners left American camps healthier than when they arrived. This fact unsettled observers in post-war Europe. Former German POWs returned home with stories that clashed sharply with Nazi-era narratives. They spoke of clean hospitals, of adequate food, of nurses who treated them without hatred. These accounts did not excuse the war. They complicated it, and in a shattered continent struggling to understand defeat. Those memories quietly undermined the ideological certainty that had fueled the conflict. But the impact did not stop. With the prisoners, for the American nurses, the war ended without fanfare. Most returned home. Quietly, their service received little public attention compared to combat units. Yet their work had left an imprint far beyond medical charts. Military historians later noted that POW treatment strengthened America's post-war moral standing. It reinforced credibility during war crimes trials. It supported reconstruction efforts in Europe by separating enemy populations from the ideologies that had ruled them. The nurses themselves rarely spoke of heroism. In interviews decades later, many described their work as simply doing the job. But the job had consequences. It demonstrated that adherence to law and ethics was not a weakness in war but a strategic and moral force. And in the long shadow of global conflict, that lesson endured. What remained was not a victory parade but a question about how wars are remembered and what truly defines strength when violence ends. War is remembered for its destruction, for fire, loss, and the collapse of certainty. But sometimes history turns on quieter moments. In a medical tent far from the front lines, power was expressed without force, authority without cruelty, victory without humiliation. The American nurses who treated Axis prisoners did not change the outcome of World War II. Battles and strategies did that. But they shaped something just as enduring: the memory of how the war was fought. For men raised on fear and propaganda, mercy became disarming. It exposed the fragility of lies that required hatred to survive. It showed that humanity could exist even where it was least expected. This was not sentimentality. It was discipline, a choice repeated thousands of times by individuals who refused to let war decide their ethics. In the aftermath of global violence, those choices mattered. They mattered to prisoners who carried those memories home. They mattered to nations rebuilding, trust from ruins. And they matter still whenever war tests whether power must abandon principle to prevail. Because sometimes the most unsettling weapon in war is not violence, but dignity, offered without conditions.